There are people who never raise their voice, yet somehow manage to control the entire room. They don't need chains or commands, only your attention, your reaction, your emotional response. And for a long time, it may feel like you are trapped in something invisible, something you cannot quite name but always feel. But then comes a moment of quiet understanding where you realize the most powerful shift does not happen when you fight harder. It happens when you stop playing the game altogether. There is a moment, quiet, almost unnoticeable at first, when something inside you begins to shift. It is not loud, it does not announce itself, and yet it changes everything. The moment you stop reacting, you stop feeding their control. Not because you have suddenly become distant or cold, but because you have finally understood that every reaction you once gave was like opening a door that someone else kept walking through without invitation. For a long time, it may feel natural to respond, to explain, to defend, to correct, to prove. You may believe that if you just say it the right way, or just show enough emotion, or just make them see your truth clearly enough, something will change. But what you slowly begin to realize is that some people are not listening to understand you. They are listening to stay in control of how you feel about yourself. And every reaction you offer becomes part of that cycle, whether you intend it or not. And then comes the deeper awareness. You begin to see that silence is not emptiness, it is interruption. When you stop reacting, something unfamiliar happens on the other side. The usual patterns no longer work. The emotional pull they once depended on begins to fade. It is not that they gain more power when you respond. It is that they lose access when you don't. This is where your strength begins to form, not in resistance, but in restraint. Because it takes far more strength to stay still in the presence of emotional pressure than it does to be pulled into it. In that stillness, you start to reclaim parts of yourself that were always getting lost in the noise. You notice how much energy was spent trying to manage other people's behavior instead of honoring your own peace. And slowly you begin to understand something deeply freeing. Not every moment requires your voice. Not every comment requires your explanation. Not every behavior deserves your participation. There is wisdom in choosing what you respond to, and even greater wisdom in recognizing when your response is exactly what keeps a cycle alive. So you begin to change, not dramatically, not loudly, but steadily. You pause where you once rushed. You breathe where you once reacted. You observe where you once absorbed. And in that space, something powerful takes root: self-possession. Because the truth reveals itself gently over time. Control only exists where reaction is given without awareness. And the moment you become aware enough to choose differently, the dynamic begins to dissolve. Not because you fought harder, but because you finally stopped offering your energy to what was never meant to hold it. There is a subtle kind of freedom that most people do not recognize at first. It does not arrive with celebration or sudden clarity. It builds slowly in the quiet spaces between what you used to feel compelled to do and what you eventually learn to release. The real power shift happens when you no longer seek their reaction. For a long time, it may feel like their attention defines the weight of your experiences. A word from them feels like approval, and a lack of response feels like uncertainty. You might not even notice how often your thoughts begin to orbit around how they will respond, what they will think, or whether they will validate what you already know to be true. And in that orbit, your peace begins to depend on something outside of you. But something changes when you begin to see the pattern for what it is. You realize that seeking their reaction is not connection. It is dependency disguised as importance. It is the quiet belief that your emotional state needs external permission. And once you see it clearly, it becomes harder to unsee. So you begin to shift. At first, it is small. You stop waiting for the reply that used to determine your mood. You stop measuring your worth by how strongly someone responds to your presence or your absence. You stop revisiting conversations in your mind, searching for a different ending. a better outcome, a version where they finally understand you the way you want to be understood. And in that space, something unfamiliar begins to settle in: stillness. Not emptiness, but stillness that belongs to you, not to their reaction. It may feel strange at first because you are no longer emotionally reaching outward for confirmation. You are simply existing without asking the world to echo you back. This is where the shift deepens. When you are no longer seeking their reaction, you are no longer available to be pulled into their emotional direction. The unspoken control begins to dissolve because it was never built on truth, it was built on your participation. And when participation stops, so does the structure that depended on it. You start to notice how much energy returns to you, energy that was once spent anticipating responses, interpreting silence, or decoding tone. You begin to understand that peace was never something they had to give you. It was something you were unknowingly handing over each time you looked outside yourself for validation. And slowly, your attention turns inward, not in isolation, but in restoration. You begin to trust your own perception without needing it confirmed. You begin to sit with your own thoughts without rushing to correct or justify them. You begin to understand that your emotional world does not need witnesses to be real. In this quiet understanding, something powerful unfolds. The need for their reaction fades, and with it, the invisible influence it once held over you. What remains is something steadier, something more grounded, a sense of self that is no longer waiting to be shaped by anyone else's response. There is a point in life where something quiet but unshakable begins to form within you. It does not come from applause, and it does not depend on recognition. It grows in the moments you stop asking the world to define you and start learning how to stand in what you already know about yourself. Your self-worth becomes untouchable when it is internally rooted. At first, it may not feel like strength. In fact, it may feel like emptiness, like something is missing because the usual reflections are no longer shaping your identity. You are no longer measuring yourself through reactions, approval, or the shifting opinions of others. And without realizing it, you begin to step away from a long habit of outsourcing your value. There was a time when a single response could lift you, and a lack of it could unsettle you. A glance, a tone, a delay in words. These small things used to carry too much meaning, but as you begin to grow inwardly, you start to see how fragile that system really was. Anything that can rise and fall based on someone else's behavior was never truly stable. So you begin to return to yourself, not in a dramatic way, but in a steady, almost unnoticeable way. You stop negotiating your worth in your mind. You stop revisiting moments where you felt unseen, trying to extract validation from memory. You stop waiting for someone else to confirm what your own heart has already begun to understand. And in that return, something changes. You become less available to emotional disruption, not because you no longer feel, but because you are no longer easily displaced. What others say or do may still reach you, but it no longer defines you. It passes through without taking root. There is a deep stillness that comes with this kind of grounding. It is not indifference. It is clarity. You begin to understand that your value was never meant to be negotiated in response to external behavior. It was meant to be recognized internally, consistently, without conditions. And when that recognition settles in, the need for validation loses its urgency. You no longer feel compelled to prove yourself in spaces that do not see you clearly. You no longer chase understanding from those who are unwilling to offer it freely. You begin to conserve your energy, not out of withdrawal, but out of respect for your own inner balance. Over time, you notice something remarkable. Situations that once disturbed you no longer pull you off center so easily. Words that once lingered in your mind begin to lose their weight, not because the world has changed, but because your foundation has. And in that shift, self-worth becomes something no longer fragile or dependent. It becomes something steady, something carried quietly within you, not announced, not performed, not validated from outside, but simply known. And once it is rooted there, it cannot be easily shaken by anything or anyone outside of it. There is a moment in every person's inner journey when the need to be right begins to feel heavier than the need to be at peace. At first, proving a point seems important, almost necessary. It feels like justice, like clarity, like finally being understood in a world that has often misunderstood you. But over time, something deeper begins to reveal itself. Not every argument is worth your energy, and not every silence is a loss. You begin to notice how often your peace was traded for participation in something that never truly resolved anything. A conversation that circles but never lands. A disagreement that grows sharper the more you try to sharpen your truth against it. And slowly, you see that the cost of being understood in certain spaces is the disturbance of your own inner stillness. So you begin to shift, not because you no longer care, but because you begin to care differently. You care more about what remains inside you after the exchange than what is proven during it. You start to understand that peace is not passive, it is chosen. And choosing it means stepping out of battles that were never designed to bring clarity, only continuation. There is a quiet strength in letting go of the urge to be heard everywhere. It does not mean your voice is less valuable. It means your energy is no longer available for spaces that require you to diminish yourself just to be acknowledged. And in that choice, something subtle but powerful begins to dissolve. The influence that conflict once had over your emotional world. You start to see how much control certain dynamics held, not because they were stronger than you, but because they kept you engaged. The moment you stop engaging in what disturbs your peace, its grip begins to weaken. Not because the situation changes, but because your participation in its emotional weight begins to fade. And what replaces that participation is not silence born of defeat, but silence born of clarity. A silence that no longer feels like retreat, but like alignment. You no longer feel the need to correct every misunderstanding or respond to every distortion. Instead, you begin to trust that what is meant to be understood will not require self-abandonment to explain. In time, you realize something that once felt impossible. Peace does not require victory. It does not need the last word. It does not depend on being proven right in every space. Peace only requires one thing, your willingness to step away from what consistently pulls you out of it. And as you practice this, something remarkable happens. The emotional pull of conflict weakens. Situations that once demanded your full attention begin to lose their intensity. Not because they disappear, but because you no longer feed them with the urgency they once received from you. What remains is something far more steady than validation. A grounded awareness that your life does not need to be a constant explanation. That your worth does not need to be defended in every moment. And that sometimes the deepest form of strength is found not in proving a point, but in protecting your peace, even when no one else understands why you chose to walk away from the noise. There is a quiet transformation that begins the moment you decide that your limits are not flexible, depending on who is testing them. At first, it may feel uncomfortable to hold your ground. You might be tempted to adjust, to soften, to make exceptions just to keep things smooth. But over time, you begin to understand that inconsistency in your boundaries is what allows confusion to enter your emotional space. When your boundaries shift depending on pressure, mood, or persuasion, others begin to learn that persistence works, not because they respect your limits, but because they recognize they are negotiable. And so the cycle continues. Push, test, withdraw, return, until you begin to feel that your own space is no longer fully yours. But something changes when your boundaries become steady. Not rigid, not aggressive, but quietly firm. You begin to say no without explanation. You begin to pause before agreeing where you once rushed. You begin to recognize that clarity does not require over-justification, and in that clarity, something unexpected happens. The dynamics around you begin to shift. Those who once relied on emotional inconsistency begin to feel uncertain, not because you have become distant, but because you have become predictable in your self-respect. There is no longer confusion about where you stand, and where there is no confusion, there is no leverage. At first, this consistency may be tested. People may push slightly harder, not always consciously, but out of habit. They may try old approaches, familiar patterns, emotional appeals that once worked. But when your response remains steady, something inside those patterns begins to lose its effectiveness. What once created reaction no longer produces the same result. And slowly, the confusion does not belong to you anymore. It shifts outward. The uncertainty moves away from your sense of self and into the expectations of others who were used to variability. You are no longer reacting from emotional pressure. You are responding from awareness. This is where your internal strength becomes visible, even when you say very little. Because consistency in boundaries is not loud. It does not require explanation or justification. It simply exists. And in its existence, it communicates something far more powerful than words ever could. That your limits are not dependent on external approval. Over time, you begin to notice that situations that once drained, you begin to settle faster. Conversations that used to spiral now end sooner. The emotional intensity that once surrounded certain interactions begins to lose its hold, not because others have changed, but because your participation in instability has decreased. And in that space, something stabilizes within you. You are no longer adjusting yourself to maintain comfort for others at the expense of your own clarity. You are no longer reshaping your boundaries to avoid discomfort. Instead, you begin to trust that the discomfort of standing firm is far less costly than the exhaustion of constantly shifting yourself. What emerges is a quieter form of power, not the kind that needs recognition, but the kind that simply holds its ground. And in that steadiness, you realize something deeply grounding. When your boundaries stop changing with pressure, the need for control around you begins to lose its direction. There is a quiet liberation that begins the moment you realize you do not owe every person access to your reasoning. For a long time, it may feel necessary to explain yourself, to clarify your choices, to justify your decisions, to make sure no misunderstanding is left unresolved. It can feel like responsibility, even like respect. But slowly, you begin to see that not every request for explanation is rooted in understanding. Sometimes it is rooted in control. At first, you may not recognize it as such. You may believe that if you simply explain yourself well enough, carefully enough, patiently enough, then confusion will turn into acceptance. But what often happens instead is repetition. The more you explain in spaces where your clarity is not truly valued, the more you find yourself being asked to explain again, as though your words are not meant to be understood, but to be continuously examined. And then something subtle begins to shift in your awareness. You notice how much energy is being spent, not just in living your life, but in defending it. You begin to see how explanation, when demanded in excess, becomes a way of keeping you emotionally engaged in dynamics that never truly move forward. It is not communication anymore, it becomes extraction. So you begin to pause before answering everything, not out of avoidance, but out of discernment. You start to recognize the difference between a question asked in genuine curiosity and a question used as a doorway into debate, justification, or emotional repositioning. And in that recognition, you begin to reclaim something important, your right to not explain what does not require external permission. There is a strength in saying less than what is expected, not because you are withholding truth, but because you are no longer offering it where it is repeatedly misunderstood on purpose or by pattern. You begin to understand that clarity does not always need repetition, and truth does not become stronger simply by being constantly defended. And in that space, something powerful dissolves, the leverage that others once had over your emotional energy. When you are no longer explaining yourself to be accepted, corrected, or reshaped, you are no longer participating in a cycle where your voice is always placed on trial. You begin to stand in your decisions without feeling the need to translate them into language that others will approve of. At first, silence in place of explanation may feel uncomfortable. You might worry that silence will be misinterpreted, or that absence of explanation will be seen as weakness or uncertainty. But over time, you begin to see something different. The world continues to move, even when you do not justify every step. And those who genuinely respect you do not require constant explanation to understand your integrity. What remains is a quieter confidence, a way of existing where your choices do not need to be constantly defended to be valid. You begin to realize that the more you explain yourself in spaces that do not listen, the more you hand over your peace. And the moment you stop offering that excess explanation, something returns to you, your energy, your focus, your sense of inner direction. And in that return, you begin to understand that not every question deserves your full response. Not every misunderstanding requires your correction, and not every moment of doubt in others requires you to shrink your certainty to make them comfortable. There is a quiet shift that happens inside a person when they stop waiting to be confirmed by others and start learning how to stand on what they already know within themselves. At first, it does not feel powerful. It feels unfamiliar, almost uncertain, because for so long, validation from outside voices may have shaped how reality felt. A word of approval could lift a day, and the absence of it could create doubt where there was none before. But slowly, something begins to settle. You start noticing how often your inner state was being handed over to people who were never responsible for it in the first place. You begin to see how easily your confidence could rise and fall based on reactions, opinions, or silence that had nothing to do with your actual worth. And in that awareness, a change begins. Not loud, not dramatic, but steady. You start turning inward in a way that is not about isolation, but about ownership. You begin to ask yourself quieter questions. Not, did they approve? But do I stand by this? Not, did they understand me? But do I understand myself clearly? And in those questions, something important starts to form, a foundation that is no longer built on response, but on recognition. When you begin to validate yourself, something subtle but powerful changes in your relationship with approval. It does not disappear, and it does not stop mattering in a human sense, but it loses its authority over you. It becomes information, not identity, a reaction, not a definition. You stop treating approval as a mirror for your worth and start seeing it as a reflection of perspective, limited, temporary, and often shaped by things that have nothing to do with you. And in that understanding, you become less easily shaken. Words that once carried heavy emotional weight begin to pass through you without settling as doubt. Praise no longer inflates you beyond truth, and criticism no longer collapses you beneath it. You begin to stand somewhere steadier, where neither end of external reaction determines who you are. There is a kind of calm that grows in this space, not because life becomes quieter, but because your dependence on its feedback becomes smaller. You stop reaching outward for confirmation before you can move forward. You begin to trust your own sense of direction, even when it is not immediately mirrored by others. And something else begins to happen. The need to constantly be seen in a certain way starts to fade. You are no longer performing your worth for acknowledgement. You are no longer adjusting your truth to make it more acceptable. You begin to exist more honestly, even if it is not always understood right away. Over time, approval loses its grip not because you reject it, but because you no longer depend on it to define you. It becomes optional rather than essential. And in that shift, a deeper form of stability emerges, one where your sense of value is no longer waiting at the mercy of external voices, but resting quietly within you, steady, grounded, and no longer easily displaced. There is a kind of strength that does not announce itself, does not rise in volume, and does not need to prove its presence. It exists in the space between impulse and response, where a person chooses not to be pulled into what is designed to disturb them. A calm response denies them the chaos they depend on. And at first, that calm may feel almost unnatural in situations that once demanded urgency, defense, or emotional reaction. For a long time, it may have felt instinctive to respond quickly, to match intensity with intensity, to meet pressure with resistance. It can seem like the only way to protect yourself is to match what is coming toward you. But over time, something begins to reveal itself. Not every situation is asking for your reaction. Some are waiting for it, feeding on it, built around it. And once you see that clearly, your response begins to change. You start noticing the space between what happens and what you do next. That small space becomes powerful. In that space, you are no longer being moved automatically by emotion or external energy. You are choosing. And choice, even in its quietest form, shifts the entire dynamic. A calm response does not mean nothing is felt. It does not mean you are unaffected or unaware. It means what you feel is no longer driving you into patterns that cost you more than they protect you. It means your awareness is stronger than your impulse. And in that strength, something important begins to dissolve. The expectation that you will always participate in emotional chaos just because it is presented to you. There are situations that rely on escalation. They grow stronger when met with urgency, louder when met with fear, and more unstable when met with resistance that is equally reactive. But calm interrupts that pattern. It removes the fuel. It does not argue with the fire. It simply stops adding to it. And in that stopping, the fire begins to lose direction. At first, others may not understand this change in you. They may expect the same reactions they once received. They may test for familiarity, looking for the old patterns to return. But when they do not, something shifts in the dynamic. The familiar cycle no longer completes itself, and what once felt predictable becomes uncertain in a way that no longer serves the same purpose. And slowly, you begin to realize that chaos often needs participation to survive. Without reaction, it has no structure to hold on to. Without emotional engagement, it begins to lose its form. This is where your calm becomes more than just composure. It becomes a boundary without noise, a statement without confrontation, a refusal without explanation. In that steadiness, you begin to reclaim energy that was once spent on reacting. You are no longer rehearsing responses in your mind or replaying moments in emotional loops. You are simply present, observing without being pulled under, and that presence becomes its own kind of protection. Over time, calm stops feeling like something you have to practice and starts becoming something you naturally return to. Not because the world has changed, but because your participation in its chaos has changed. And in that quiet shift, you realize something lasting. What once demanded your reaction no longer has access to your peace unless you choose to give it. There is a moment in awareness when you begin to see that not everything meant to pull at your emotions deserves your participation. For a long time, emotional intensity may have felt like connection, feeling deeply, reacting quickly, staying engaged even when it cost you peace. It can feel like caring too much is the same as being loyal, and staying emotionally available in every situation is the same as being strong. But over time, you begin to notice that not every emotional pull is rooted in sincerity. Some patterns are not built to understand you. They are built to keep you engaged. And when you remain emotionally entangled in those patterns, your energy becomes part of a cycle that repeats itself without resolution. The more you respond from emotion alone, the more the cycle continues. It feeds on reaction, attention, and emotional availability. And without realizing it, you may find yourself revisiting the same dynamics again and again, each time expecting a different outcome. Emotional detachment, in this sense, is not absence of feeling. It is presence of awareness. It is the ability to feel without being controlled by what you feel. It is the quiet decision to step back from automatic emotional involvement when you recognize that your participation is no longer creating clarity, but confusion.